The bonding fire had been burning since sundown. Rena Voss stood at the entrance of the great hall of Asheville Keep, dressed in the white ceremonial gown they had laid out for her that morning. White for purity, white for new beginnings, white for the future that stretched ahead of a woman claimed by her true mate. She had pressed the fabric between her fingers when she first put it on, feeling the softness of it, thinking of all the times Calder had told her that the moment she wore this dress would be the best night of his life. That was 3 months ago. Now, standing at the threshold with 500 wolves watching her walk forward, Rena could feel something had already broken before she even took her first step. It lived in the silence, in the way certain eyes slid away from hers as she passed, in the way Elder Bryn was not smiling the way she always smiled, in the way Calder Asheville, Alpha of the 5 Borders, Lord of every territory from the Ridgestone Mountains to the Saltmarsh coast, was not looking at her. He was looking at the ground. Rena kept walking. Her chin was up. Her steps were even. She had learned long ago that dignity was the only armor a woman with no family name could afford, and she wore it now like she wore the white dress, carefully, deliberately, because she knew it was all that stood between her and whatever was coming. The bonding fire crackled at the center of the hall. Ancient wood, soaked in pine resin and moon water, burning silver and gold in turns. It was the most sacred flame in Asheville tradition, lit only for the binding of mates. When 2 bonded wolves pressed their hands over that fire together, the magic of the mate bond sealed itself into the flame and rose into the sky as smoke the entire kingdom could see. Every wolf in this hall had come to witness that smoke rise. Rena reached the inner circle and stopped before the fire. She looked across it at Calder. He was as beautiful as he had always been. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like carved stone and eyes the color of deep amber that had once looked at her with a warmth that made her feel like the only person in any room. She had fallen in love with those eyes before she even fully understood what falling meant. But right now those eyes were cold, not cruel, not angry, just empty in the way that was worse than either of those things, like something that had been living behind them had quietly packed its belongings and left. "Rena Voss," Elder Bryn said, and her voice was the sound of a door closing. "Daughter of no house, you have been presented before the 5 border packs as the claimed mate of Alpha Calder Asheville. Do you accept this bond freely and without coercion?" "I do," Rena said. Her voice did not shake. The elder turned to Calder. And that was when the world fell apart. Calder raised his head. He looked at Rena for the first time since she had entered the hall, truly looked at her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that might have been pain or guilt or the ghost of the man she had loved. It was there for only a moment. Then it was gone, pressed under by something colder and more final. "I do not accept this bond," he said. The hall went so quiet Rena could hear the fire breathing. "I reject the claim," Calder continued, each word falling like a stone dropped into deep water. "Rena Voss carries no bloodline worthy of the Asheville name. She carries no legacy that my wolves can be proud of. She is," he paused, and for just 1 second his jaw tightened and she thought she was sure she saw his hand tremble at his side. "She is worthless to this throne." Worthless. The word moved through the hall like a wave. She heard gasps. She heard a woman sob quietly somewhere near the back. She heard the low, restless sounds of wolves shifting and stirring, the way a pack moves when something deeply wrong has just been spoken aloud. Rena did not move. She stood before the bonding fire and she did not move, because she understood that if she moved, if she stepped backward or reached for the edge of the circle or showed even one crack in the surface of who she was standing there, she would never get it back. So she breathed. She looked at Calder and she breathed. And then, because there was nothing else to say and everything left to survive, she turned and walked back through the parted crowd without a single word. Behind her, she heard Elder Bryn speaking in a low, shocked murmur. She heard Myra Davin, the copper-haired daughter of Lord Aldrich Davin, who had been at Calder's side in every official court gathering for the past 2 months. stepped closer to the alpha with a soft sound that was not quite comfort and not quite triumph, but lived somewhere ugly in between. Rena did not look back. She walked through the great iron doors of Asheville Keep and out into the cold night air, and she felt the mate bond, that living thread of warmth and recognition that had existed between her and Calder, since the night they first touched, shudder once inside her chest like a candle going out in the wind. It did not break entirely. A rejection could cloud a bond, could suppress it, could bury it beneath shame and denial. But the bond between fated mates could not be truly unmade, not even by the words of a king. She pressed one hand to her stomach, where something small and secret, and entirely her own, was already beginning. She had not told him. She had planned to tell him at the bonding ceremony, in a quiet moment afterward when the fire had settled and they were alone. She had imagined the look on his face. She had played it forward in her mind 100 times, the way his eyes would go soft, the way he would pull her close, the way this child would be the thing that sealed every good thing between them. Now she stood alone in the cold, and understood that she would be the only one who knew. The wilderness opened ahead of her, dark trees, cold stars, a road that led away from everything she had built her hopes on. She had been given exile provisions, a half-filled traveling sack, a thin cloak, a handful of coins that would last perhaps a week. A guard had set them at the outer gate without meeting her eyes. She took them, she wrapped the cloak around her shoulders, she began to walk. She was 23 years old, she was pregnant, she had nothing and no one. She walked anyway. 3 days into the forest, Rena almost died for the first time. She had been following a creek northward, reasoning that water meant direction and direction meant survival, when the ice shelf she was stepping on gave way beneath her boot, and she plunged to her knee in freezing water. The cold seized her leg like a fist. She crashed sideways into the bank, barely catching herself on a root, and for a long moment she simply lay there with her cheek against the frozen ground, breathing hard, watching her breath mist in the darkness. "Get up," she told herself. "You are carrying someone who has not yet seen the sky. Get up." She got up. That was how the days worked, out here. She fell and she got up. She found water and she found scraps, frozen berries beneath the snow, roots she recognized from a herbalist's guide she had read in the keep's library, the occasional rabbit caught in a simple snare she fashioned from a bootlace. Her hands were cracked and raw. Her feet ached constantly. Every morning she woke colder than she had gone to sleep, and every morning she reminded herself of the heartbeat that was not yet hers alone, and she moved. She thought about Calder constantly and tried not to. She thought about the way he used to find her in the lunar gardens after his council meetings, leaning against the doorway with that almost smile that was only ever for her. The way he had once spent an entire afternoon teaching her the Asheville star charts because she had offhandedly mentioned she didn't know them. The way he had told her, his mouth against her hair, his arms tight around her shoulders, on a night when the moon was full and the whole world felt like it was holding its breath, that she was the only person he had ever truly trusted. She is worthless to this throne. She turned the words over and over like stones in her hands, trying to find the man she had loved inside them. She could not. And yet she knew, with the bone-deep certainty that the mate bond carried even now, muffled and suppressed and buried under whatever had happened in those last 3 weeks before the ceremony, that the man who had spoken those words was not entirely the man she had known. Something had changed in him, gradually and then suddenly, the way a fire goes from warmth to ash. She just didn't know what. On the 7th night, she found the others. She had smelled them before she saw them. 3 wolves huddled at the base of a collapsed stone wall in what had once been. Judging by the overgrown foundations, some kind of hunting lodge. They were rogues. She could tell by the way they held themselves, the particular wariness of wolves who belonged to no pack. 2 females and 1 older male with a scar that ran from his ear to his jaw. She stopped 30 feet away, calculating. The scarred male raised his head and looked at her with eyes that were ancient and tired, and she realized slowly, not threatening, "You're from Asheville," he said, not a question. He had caught her scent on the wind. "I was," Rena said carefully, "not anymore." A long pause. Then the male Edric, she would learn later former beta of a pack that had been dissolved by border wars 6 years back, simply shifted to make space at the wall and said, "Sit, then. There's warmth in numbers." It was not friendship. Not yet. But it was the first time in 7 days that someone had spoken to her without contempt, and she moved toward the warmth before she even decided to. The two females were Senna, young, fierce, with the quick eyes of someone who had been surviving alone long enough to make an art of it, and Osha, older, quiet, with healer's hands that she used efficiently and without fanfare. By morning they had looked at Rena's cracked hands and her thin frame, and the way she instinctively pressed her palm to her belly when she thought no one was watching, and they had understood things she hadn't said. "You're with Pup," Osha said. It was not an accusation. "Yes." "How far along?" "Nearly 4 months." Osha nodded once, with the gravity of someone assessing a practical problem. "Then we will need to find real shelter before the deep cold comes." The word settled over Rena like a second cloak. She had not asked for their help. She had not told them her story. She had offered nothing except her presence at the wall, and these wolves, cast out, broken, surviving, had simply looked at her and decided she was theirs to protect. In the dark of that ruined lodge, pressed between Senna's warmth on one side and the stone wall on the other, Rena felt something she had not let herself feel since the ceremony. She felt grateful to be alive. They found the temple on a morning when the mist hung so low it erased the treetops. Edric had been tracking a deer trail northward when he came across the ruins, a circular structure, walls still mostly standing, carved from granite that had been old before anyone living could remember. Rena stepped through the collapsed doorway behind him and stopped. She knew immediately what this place was. The carvings, 5 wolves running beneath a crescent moon, repeated in a band around the interior walls. A central altar carved from the same pale granite, worn smooth by centuries of use. The symbols that framed every archway, the old-tongue script that she had seen once, as a child, in a book her grandmother had pressed into her hands before she died. This was a Vas temple, her family's temple. The Vas name meant almost nothing in the 5 kingdoms now. Her grandmother had carried it like a weight, speaking of it rarely and with careful grief. And what little Rena knew suggested her bloodline had been respectable once before some catastrophe she had never been given the full shape of. But standing here, in this place that bore her family's sacred symbols on every wall, she felt the hair rise on her arms. "Give me a moment," she told the others. She moved to the altar alone. Beneath her hand, the surface was ice cold and perfectly smooth, except for one section near the base, where the stone sounded hollow when she pressed it. She knelt, felt along the edge. Her fingers found the seam and she pressed, and the stone panel shifted inward with a sound like held breath finally released. Inside the hidden space, 3 leather-bound journals, wrapped in oilskin, preserved by some art she did not understand. The first journal belonged to a woman named Elindra Vas. The date on the first entry was 40 years ago. Rena sat on the temple floor in the cold and read. She read for 3 hours. When she looked up, Senna was sitting cross-legged nearby watching her with careful eyes, and Rena's face was wet. "What does it say?" Senna asked. Rena pressed her hand to the open page. The words swam. She steadied herself. "It says," she managed, "that my grandmother was the most gifted moon reader in 5 kingdoms history. It says she served the council of 5 alphas faithfully for 20 years. It says she was the one who discovered that the Davin family, Lord Aldrich Davin's grandfather, had been falsifying border treaties to steal Vas land and Vas resources for 2 generations. She paused. "And it says that when she brought this evidence to the alphas, the Davin family had her convicted of treason. They forged documents. They paid witnesses. They destroyed her name and scattered her bloodline so thoroughly that no one living would ever trust a Voss word again. Silence in the temple. Myra Davin, Senna said slowly, the woman standing beside your alpha at the ceremony. Lord Aldrich Davin's daughter, Rena said. Yes. She closed the journal carefully. She held it against her chest. Her grandmother had not been a traitor. Her bloodline had not been worthless. They had been destroyed deliberately, systematically, by a family that had needed them silenced. And that family was still in power, still whispering in the ears of kings, still doing what they had always done. Worthless. Rena felt the word change shape inside her. It had felt like a wound when Calder said it. Now it felt like a key. It unlocked something she had not known was locked. A clear, cold understanding of what this exile truly was, and what her children would be born into if she did nothing. She gathered all 3 journals and wrapped them back in their oilskin. She was going to need them. On the morning of the 7th day after Rena's exile, Calder Asheville woke screaming. Not a sound he made. The scream was inside him, a tearing, animal sound that lived behind his ribs and had no words attached to it. Only sensation, loss, wrongness, something vital being cut away from him by a blade he could not see. He sat up in the cold of his chambers and put his hands over his face and tried to breathe. The bond, even muffled, even buried under whatever had been given to him in the teas that Lord Aldrich Davin personally brewed for the king's evening council meetings. The bond found him in sleep when his defenses were lowest. In his dreams, he always knew. In his dreams, Rena was alive and real and looking at him with those dark eyes that carried the particular quiet of someone who had seen hard things and decided not to be broken by them. In his dreams, he reached for her. He woke reaching for nothing. Calder got out of bed. He crossed to the window. Below, the courtyard of Asheville Keep went about its morning routines, guards at their posts, stable hands with their horses, the smell of bread baking in the kitchens. Normal things, the world continuing as though nothing had happened. He had told himself in the 3 weeks before the ceremony that what he felt was the logical result of evidence presented. Lord Aldrich had come to him with documents and letters bearing Rena's name. An account from a pack healer claiming Rena had tried to solicit a blood-masking herb that could hide the true parentage of a child. Aldrich had been careful, sympathetic, deeply concerned. I take no pleasure in this, my king. But you deserve the truth before you bind yourself to a woman who may be carrying another man's pup. Calder had read the documents 3 times. He had noticed, somewhere in the back of his mind, that the handwriting on the letters did not look quite like Rena's, that the healer Aldrich had produced was someone he did not recognize, from a border settlement he had never visited, that every piece of evidence came through Aldrich, never from any independent source. He had noticed all of this and pushed it down, because underneath it was the thing he could not look at directly, that he was afraid. That loving Rena had made him more vulnerable than he had ever been in his life, and some dark, cowardly part of him had been almost relieved when Aldrich gave him a reason to pull back before she had the power to destroy him. She is worthless to this throne. He had said those words and felt them land in her chest through the bond, felt them like blows he was absorbing as well as dealing, and he had stood completely still and let the cold take over because he did not know what else to do with the horror of what he was choosing. That morning he sat in his study and he looked at the documents again. Properly, this time, without the nightly teas blurring the edges of his judgment. He had not taken the teas in 4 days. He had told the servants he was sleeping poorly and preferred only water at night, and he had watched Aldrich's expression very carefully when he mentioned this, and what he saw there was not concern. It was calculation. He pulled out Rena's old letters to him, personal letters, from the early months of their courtship, when she used to leave notes in his library books. He placed them beside the documents Aldrich had provided. The handwriting was not even close. Calder sat back in his chair, and something moved through him like a cold tide, grief and rage, and the particular shame of a man who has let fear make him into something he would never forgive. He had exiled his mate. He had exiled her while she was. His mind went back to certain moments, certain small things he had noticed and set aside without examining while she was pregnant. He stood up so fast the chair scraped back across the stone floor. "Fetch Elder Bryn," he said to the guard at his door, "and tell me where Lord Aldrich Davin is right now." Rena labored in the dead of winter, in a cave system behind a frozen waterfall, with no one but Edric, Senna, and Osha to witness it. Osha had found the cave 6 weeks into the exile, a proper cave, deep enough to hold warmth, with a spring running through the back chamber that never froze. They had made it as comfortable as 4 people with limited supplies could make anything. Fur bedding, a small hearth. Herbs Osha had gathered and dried with the quiet competence of someone who had been healing without resources for years. When the contractions began, Rena was gathering firewood from the cave's entrance. The first one dropped her to one knee in the snow. She knelt there for a count of 10, breathing through it, then straightened and walked back to the others. "It's time," she said. Osha was already moving. The next 12 hours were the hardest thing Rena had ever survived, and she had survived a lot. She did not scream for most of it, not because she was trying to be brave, but because screaming would not help, and she needed every piece of herself focused on the work of this. But in the deepest part of the labor, when the pain crested beyond anything she had been able to prepare for, she did make a sound. A long, raw, open sound that was not quite human and not quite wolf and came from somewhere below language. Senna gripped her hand on one side. Osha murmured instructions in a low, steady voice. Edric stood at the cave entrance with his back turned, keeping watch, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was shaking. She thought of Calder once, and it was not with love, it was with a cold, furious clarity. "You should be here," she thought. "You should be carrying some of this." And then the thought was swept away by a wave of effort that asked everything she had. The first child came just before midnight. Rena heard Osha make a sound she had never heard from the older woman before, a sharp inhale, almost frightened. She looked down. The pup was a girl, dark hair, already visible in the new skin. She was perfect and small and crying with the particular outrage of someone who has just discovered that the world is cold and extremely inconvenient. But it was not the crying that made Osha's breath catch. It was the light. Beginning at the child's sternum and spreading outward across her chest in thin, luminous lines like frost moving across glass, but silver bright and warm, was a pattern, a marking. Rena had never seen anything like it in her life. It looked ancient. It looked deliberate. It looked like something that had been waiting inside this child for a very long time and had simply arrived. "What is that?" Senna breathed. Before Rena could answer, the second contraction hit. The second child, a boy, bigger than his sister, with his mother's jaw and a pair of lungs that announced his arrival without any hesitation, came 40 minutes later. He too bore a marking, this one across his left shoulder and down his arm, a pattern of interlocking symbols that pulsed once with gold light before settling into a soft glow that made the cave walls look like sunrise. The moment both children drew breath in the same room, something happened that none of them had words for. It was not a sound exactly, or it was a sound but one that moved through the chest rather than the ears, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come up from the ground itself. The waterfall outside the cave, which had been frozen solid, cracked in 3 places. The spring at the back of the cave ran faster, and the fire they had built, small, carefully rationed, blazed suddenly bright and hot without consuming any additional wood. Osha was trembling. "I have been a healer for 31 years, she said quietly, "and I have attended more births than I can count." She looked at the 2 children in Rena's arms, at the silver and gold light that played softly between them like they were communicating in a language predating words. "I have never seen anything like this." Rena held her children and felt something lock into place inside her, something that had no name but felt like the truest thing she had ever carried. Vela, she said to her daughter, and Bran. She looked at her son and then up at the cave ceiling as if she could see through it to the sky. You are going to change everything. She did not know how right she was. Far away, across 2 mountain ranges and a frozen river, in 5 separate keep halls belonging to the 5 most powerful alpha bloodlines on the continent, wolves woke from sleep with their hearts pounding. Pack leaders stumbled to their windows and looked at the sky without knowing why. Children cried. Old wolves pressed their hands to their chests and felt something they had not felt in generations. A presence, a recognition, an alarm sounded in the marrow of the world. And in the throne room of Asheville Keep, every candle in the hall lit simultaneously, without a hand or a spark or any reason at all. Calder had not slept in 4 days. He sat in his war room with Aldrich Davin's documents spread before him, alongside every letter Rena had ever written to him, alongside testimony he had gathered, quietly, carefully, from servants and guards who had interacted with Aldrich's household in the months before the ceremony. And the picture it assembled was damning in a direction he had not expected. Elder Bryn sat across from him, her weathered face carefully still. Lord Aldrich forged the documents, Calder said. It was not a question anymore. There is little doubt, Elder Bryn confirmed. I have spoken with the healer he produced as witness. The woman is from a Davin border village. She was paid. She is willing to recant now that she understands the severity of what she participated in. And the teas. Bryn's expression shifted. I had the kitchen stores tested by an independent healer this morning. A pause that carried weight. There was a compound in the dried herbs Lord Aldrich donated to the keep's evening supply. A compound that, used over several months, affects the clarity of instinctive judgment. It does not control behavior directly. It simply quiets the parts of the mind that question evidence and amplifies doubt. Calder was quiet for a very long time. So I was drugged, he said. You were, Bryn said gently. But my king, I say this with respect and with genuine care for you, the compound works by widening cracks that already exist. If there was no fear there, no pre-existing wound, it would have had little effect. Calder looked at his hands. He thought of his father, who had loved a woman who destroyed him. He thought of the way he had spent his entire adult life learning not to need anyone too much, holding every person he valued at a distance that felt like safety, and was actually just loneliness with better armor. He thought of Rena, who had gotten through every wall without even trying, not by being extraordinary in some grand way, but simply by being consistently, stubbornly, quietly herself. He thought of the moment at the bonding fire when her eyes had met his and she had understood what was about to happen, the way she had not begged, the way she had simply lifted her chin and decided to survive. She is worthless to this throne. He would hear himself say those words until he died. Where is Lord Aldrich now? His voice was very calm. In his chambers. He is expecting an invitation to dinner. Calder stood. He will receive something else entirely. He turned toward the door, then stopped. Bryn, I need every tracker we have assembled and moving within the hour. I need to find her. Elder Bryn rose to her feet, and for the first time since the ceremony, she looked at him with something other than carefully controlled disappointment. I had them standing ready, she said, from the moment you first asked me to come here. 3 floors below, Myra Davin sat in her guest chambers and read the letter she had received from her father that morning. The Alpha is asking questions. The compound should still be working, but something has changed. You must deepen your position before he recovers his clarity. Use whatever means you have. Myra set the letter down. She pressed her lips together. She had not been ignorant of what her father was doing. She had been raised in this, shaped by it, taught from childhood that the Davin family protected its power by removing threats before they could speak. She had gone along with it because going along was what she knew how to do. But she had been at the bonding ceremony. She had seen Rena Voss walk through that crowd with her head up and her face composed, carrying something enormous in silence. She had seen Calder speak those words and she had felt, under all the triumph she had prepared herself to feel something much colder. She had seen a man destroying the only real thing he had ever built. Myra Davin looked at her father's letter for a long time. Then she folded it and went to find Elder Bryn. Word moved through the 5 kingdoms the way wildfire moves, faster than anyone who starts it intends. It began with the wolves who had woken that night, those who had felt the pulse from nowhere, the presence that cracked their sleep and left them standing at their windows in the dark, wondering. They spoke of it first in private, then in pack meetings, then at border councils where representatives from multiple bloodlines gathered. Everyone who had felt it carried the same description, like a door opening that had been shut for 100 years. Like something breathing that had been held underwater and finally broke the surface. The old wolves, the historians, the elder keepers, went very pale when they heard this, because there was only one event in the recorded memory of the 5 kingdoms that could produce a sensation like that. The birth of a moon-marked child. Not just rare, vanishingly rare. There had been perhaps 4 such births in 500 years of recorded history, children born with the marking, a physical pattern that signified something older than pack law and bloodline politics, a chosen connection to the moon's own power that skipped bloodlines and refused to be predicted and could not be forced or bought or arranged. When 2 moon-marked children were born at once in the same hour from the same mother, there was no precedent for it. None. The elder texts described a prophecy that most scholars had classified as allegory. When 2 markings rise together, the old lies will not survive the light. No one had taken it literally. Now they were taking it very literally indeed. By the time Calder's search party was 3 days into the wilderness, representatives from 2 of the other 4 alpha bloodlines had dispatched their own riders, not to pursue Rena, but to find her, to see with their own eyes what their instincts and their histories were telling them was true. And in the cave behind the frozen waterfall, Rena was unaware of any of this. She was surviving. She was learning to be a mother with no manual and no safety net, with Osha's quiet guidance and Senna's fierce protectiveness and Edric's steady, understated loyalty. Vela was loud and demanding and already had opinions about everything, expressed with a passionate nonverbal eloquence that made Senna laugh. Bran was quieter, watchful, with large dark eyes that seemed to be cataloging everything around him with an attention that felt deliberate for a creature who had been alive for 3 weeks. The markings on both of them dimmed when they slept and brightened when they were awake, responding to emotion stronger when they were distressed, soft and steady when they were content. When they lay side by side, the silver and gold patterns reached toward each other and entwined at the edges, like they were communicating something their bodies had no other language for. Rena watched them one evening while the others slept. She sat in the firelight with a child on each arm and read her grandmother's journals for the 4th time, and slowly the shape of what she was carrying, not just in her arms but in her history, in her blood, in the purpose she had arrived at through the most terrible path imaginable, became clear to her. Elindra Voss had known. The final journal entry, written in a hand that was getting shakier as the days of her imprisonment shortened, described a vision her grandmother had had in the last week of her life. Not a comfortable vision, not a reassuring one, but a specific one. "She will come from my daughter's daughter," Elindra had written, "the last of our name, stripped and cast out and called nothing, and she will give birth alone in the dark with no king beside her. And the children she carries will be the reckoning that my generation could not deliver. I go to my end in peace knowing this. Let whoever finds these pages carry them to her. She will know what they mean." Rena sat very still, with the journal open on her knee. Her grandmother had written this for her. 40 years ago, dying in a cell in a keep that no longer existed, Elindra Voss had seen this cave, and these children and this fire. Rena closed the journal and looked at Vela and Bran, at the soft intertwined glow of their markings, at the absolute trust with which they slept in her arms, and something that had been cracked inside her since the ceremony settled, not into healing but into purpose. She was done surviving. It was time to prepare. Calder found her on a morning when the clouds broke and let through a shaft of pale gold light that hit the frozen waterfall and set the whole face of the hillside sparkling. He almost missed it. The cave entrance was invisible unless you knew where to look, hidden by an overhang and a curtain of ice-draped roots, and he would have passed by if his wolf had not stopped him. Not with thought, just with feeling. A sudden absolute stillness in his chest, like a compass needle swinging north. She is here. He stopped. He raised a hand and his search party stopped behind him. He stood very still and let himself breathe. Then Edric appeared from behind the waterfall, and every tracker in Calder's party tensed, and Calder said quietly, "Stand down," and walked forward alone. Edric watched him come with the flat assessment of a man who has seen enough of the world to be unimpressed by alpha titles. "She knows you're here," Edric said. "She asked that I tell you she will come out but you may not come in." Calder nodded. He waited. When Rena emerged from behind the waterfall, the first thing he felt was the bond, not muffled now, not buried under weeks of compound-laced tea, but raw and immediate and devastating in both directions, carrying everything she had felt and survived in the past months flowing into him before he had any defense against it. The cold, the hunger, the fear she had never let herself show, the loneliness of a woman lying awake in a cave with new life moving inside her and no one to tell. And underneath all of it, buried deep but not gone, love, furious and hurt and exhausted and entirely, stubbornly alive. He nearly went to his knees from the weight of it. Rena stood 10 feet away and looked at him. She was thinner than she had been, and harder in some way that had nothing to do with cruelty, the hardness of someone who has found out exactly what they are made of and decided to be proud of it. She wore patched clothing and her dark hair was loose, and the only thing she carried was, he saw it then, 2 small bundles in her arms, wrapped in fur, and a light that was not from the sun was coming from them. Calder could not speak. Rena watched him absorb it. She let him see. She let the silence stretch long enough to carry everything it needed to. "You have a daughter," she said at last, "and a son." He made a sound that he had no name for. "You do not get to come to me yet," Rena said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were bright. "You do not get to arrive with a search party and a face like that and believe it undoes anything. I need you to understand what you did before we have any conversation about what comes next." "I understand what I did," Calder said. He did not bother hiding what was on his face. He was done hiding things. "I was drugged, and I let it work because I was afraid and I was a coward, and what I said to you I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the chance to be forgiven for." Rena was quiet for a moment. "Who?" she said. "Aldrich Davin. The compound was in the teas he had the kitchens prepare for council meetings. He produced false evidence. His daughter has since confirmed everything." A pause. Myra came to Elder Bryn herself. Something moved across Rena's face that was complicated and not quite what he expected. "I am not surprised," she said. She shifted one of the bundles in her arms, and the gold light pulsed gently. "My grandmother warned me about the Davin family 40 years ago, in a journal hidden in our family's temple, which I found in this forest." Calder looked at her. "There is a great deal," Rena said carefully, "that you and I need to talk about. But first," she took one step forward and turned the smaller bundle slightly so he could see the face inside. Dark eyes, a little unfocused the way new things are, and a silver pattern across the tiny chest that glowed like moonlight. "This is Vela." He could not breathe. And this, the second bundle, the boy, who chose that moment to open his eyes and look directly at his father with an attention that was startlingly clear, is Bran. Bran's gold marking brightened. The bond between Calder and his son snapped into place like a physical thing. A recognition so complete and immediate it drove the air from Calder's chest. He put one hand over his mouth. He felt tears come and did not try to stop them, because he was done performing strength that had always been mostly fear wearing armor. "Please," he said, it came out rough, "please let me hold them." Rena studied him for a long moment. Then she crossed the distance between them and placed Vela carefully in his arms. "Support her head," she said quietly. "She has no patience for being held badly." Calder held his daughter like she was made of light, which was not entirely inaccurate. Vela looked up at him with her mother's eyes, and her silver marking glowed, and the bond sealed between them, and Calder felt it fill in spaces in him that had been empty for so long he had stopped noticing the shape of the emptiness. "I should have been here," he said. "Yes," Rena said. No softening of it, no comfort she didn't owe him. "You should have." "Tell me how to make it right." "You start," she said, "by listening. I have a great deal to tell you about what my grandmother discovered about the Davin family. And then we are going to go back to Asheville, and we are going to do this properly, not the way it should have been done at the ceremony, but better. On my terms." Calder met her eyes. "Whatever terms you set." "That is the right answer," Rena said. And for the first time, something in her face shifted, not forgiveness, not yet, but the recognition that the man she had loved was still in there, alive, fighting its way back through whatever had been done to him. "Now, tell your trackers to make camp a decent distance away. You and I need to talk alone." They returned to Asheville on a morning that the whole kingdom seemed to be waiting for, though no announcement had been made. Word moves in packs. A tracker tells a border guard. A border guard sends a message to a cousin in the inner city. The cousin tells 3 people. By the time Rena rode through the outer gates of Asheville Keep, not on a servant's horse, not with exile provisions in a thin bag, but at the head of a riding party with Edric and Senna and Osha flanking her and 2 infants in a carrier against her chest, their markings visible even from the walls. The road from the gates to the keep entrance was lined with wolves. They were silent. Not the contemptuous silence of the bonding ceremony, when everyone had looked away from her disgrace. This was a different kind of silence, the held-breath kind, the kind a crowd holds when something they do not have words for is happening in front of them. Rena looked straight ahead. Calder rode a measured distance behind her, because this was not his entrance. He had made clear to his search party and to his household that this day belonged to her. She would set the order of it, and he would follow. The throne room had been prepared for a formal council of reckoning. All 5 alpha representatives were present. Calder had sent ravens from the forest, and all 4 of the other kingdom leaders had responded, which had not happened in living memory without a war to prompt it. The presence of moon-marked children had a way of commanding attention that even the most political alpha could not comfortably ignore. Elder Bryn stood at the front, and beside her stood a pale and visibly frightened Lord Aldrich Davin, already in the council's custody. Myra stood apart from her father, her face composed in the careful way of someone who has decided to pay a debt and is resolved not to flinch at the cost. Rena walked into the throne room and the assembly rose. All of them. Alphas who had never bowed to anyone rose to their feet, not from compulsion but from something older and more involuntary. The same instinct that had woken them from sleep 2 months ago, now recognizing its source. Rena stopped at the center of the room. She looked at Aldrich. He looked back, and what she saw in his eyes was not quite regret and not quite fear, but something between them that recognized it had run out of road. "You destroyed my grandmother," she said. The room was so quiet her voice carried without effort. "You forged her conviction. You scattered her family so thoroughly that her granddaughter grew up with nothing, no name, no history, no protection. You did it to protect a lie your own grandfather built." She tilted her head slightly. "And then you tried to do it again to me, because the Voss bloodline still frightened you even when you thought it had nothing left." Aldrich said nothing. "I want the council to know," Rena continued, turning now to address the assembled alphas, "that I do not carry my grandmother's journals as a weapon. I carry them as evidence. There is a difference. The Davin land and treaty falsifications are documented in detail. The forged witness testimonies from 40 years ago are documented. The compound used on Alpha Calder over 6 months." She did not look at Calder as she said this, though she felt his presence at the edge of the room, is documented. She reached into the satchel at her side and drew out the 3 oilskin-wrapped journals and set them on the council table. These are for the record, she said, not for vengeance, for truth, because my grandmother believed that the truth, given enough time and the right vessel, would eventually find its way into the light. She looked down at Vela and Bran in the carrier against her chest. The markings on both of them brightened, as if responding to the word truth, or to the room full of wolves whose attention was now entirely fixed on them. The reaction was immediate. Every alpha representative in the room went still in the way of wolves who have just registered a threat or a wonder, unable to tell which. The oldest of them, Aldrich Frayne of the Western Ridge, who had been leading his bloodline for 40 years, and had the look of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything, leaned forward with an expression Rena had never seen on an alpha's face before. Reverence. Moon-marked, Frayne said very quietly, both of them. Both, Elder Bryn confirmed. Her voice was not entirely steady. The room filled with the sound of 500 years of history realigning itself. Aldrich Davin was taken to the council's custody without drama or resistance. He had the look of a man who had always known this day existed somewhere ahead of him and had simply been running from it. Myra's testimony was recorded in full. The documents were verified by 3 independent elder witnesses. By the time the council session was formally closed, 3 hours later, the Davin border territories had been suspended from treaty protection pending full review, and the Voss name, Rena's name, her grandmother's name, a name that had been made into a curse 2 generations before she was born, had been formally restored to the record as a bloodline wrongly condemned. It was not everything, it was a beginning. The harder conversation happened that night. Calder found her in the lunar garden, which someone had kept carefully tended in her absence. She was sitting on the stone bench where she used to sit in the evenings when she couldn't sleep, with both children asleep in a carry cradle beside her, and she was reading the 3rd of Elindra's journals for what Calder strongly suspected was not the first time. He stopped at the garden entrance, waited. "You can come in," she said without looking up. He sat across from her, not beside her, far enough to give her space, close enough to be present. The moonlight came through the garden's open arches and lay silver across the grass, and Vela's marking glowed gently in her sleep like a response to it. They sat in silence for a while. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have said the most important things, and are now figuring out what lives after them. "I don't know how to do this," Calder said at last. "I have been very certain for a very long time that I knew how to do most things. I do not know how to do this." "What specifically?" Rena asked. She was looking at him now, studying him with those dark, patient eyes. "Earn you back," he said. "I know what I owe you. I know there is no version of an apology that is adequate. I know that what I said at the ceremony, what I chose, even under the compound's influence, was not just words. It was an action, and actions have consequences." He paused. "I want to try. I want to earn the right to try. But I don't know what that looks like, and I think it has to be something you define, not me." Rena set the journal down in her lap. "What it looks like," she said carefully, "is that we take it one day at a time, and I decide, based on what you do, not what you say, whether the man I loved is still in there and whether he is capable of being better than he was." Her voice was not harsh. It was truthful, which was harder. "I am not going to pretend the bond doesn't exist. I am not going to pretend I stopped loving you, because that would be a lie, and I have had enough of those. But love and trust are not the same thing, and what you broke was the trust." "I know," Calder said. And she added, and something in her voice shifted slightly, not quite warmth, but the possibility of it, like a window opened a crack. "You have children. 2 children who are going to grow up in a world that will be fascinated and frightened by what they carry. They are going to need both of us fully present and fully honest with each other, which means you and I have to build something real, regardless of what it costs." She glanced at the sleeping twins. "They are worth it." "They are," Calder agreed. He looked at them too, and his expression was the one she had seen when she first put Vela in his arms, open and wondering and stripped of every shield he had ever built. They are extraordinary. They get that from their grandmother, Rena said, and something in the way she said it made Calder look at her, and she let him see just for a moment the grief she usually kept very quietly in the back of things. For Elindra, who had written to her across 40 years and never gotten to know she had been heard. Calder reached across the space between them. He set his hand palm up on the bench, an offering, not a demand. Rena looked at it for a long moment. Then she set her hand in his. It was not a reunion. It was not forgiveness wrapped up and finished. It was a first step, one hand in another in the moonlight, which is how most real things begin. Above them, the moon was full and clear, and in the carry cradle beside the bench, Vela's silver marking and Bran's gold marking glowed together in the dark. 3 months later, the bonding ceremony was held again. Not in the great hall. In the open air, on the lawn that stretched from Asheville Keep's eastern gate to the cliff edge that overlooked the Ridgestone Valley below, because Rena had said she did not want walls around her for this, and Calder had said whatever she wanted. The 5 alpha bloodlines were present, representatives from every pack under the 5 Borders Treaty, Edric, Senna, and Osha, who had been given formal wolf's welcome into the Asheville pack on Rena's insistence and Calder's immediate agreement, stood in places of honor at the front. Elder Bryn officiated, wearing an expression of such profound relief that it had smoothed 20 years from her face. There was no silver cord this time, no formal charges read aloud, no one on a raised dais looking down. Just 2 people standing across a small fire from each other, and 2 sleeping children in a cradle set carefully between them, so they were present for this too. Rena Voss, Elder Bryn said, and this time the name was not a designation of no house, no history, no worth. It was simply who she was. Do you accept this bond freely and with full knowledge of everything it has cost? I do, Rena said, not because it is easy, because it is true. Calder Asheville, Elder Bryn turned to him. Do you accept this bond freely and with full understanding of what it requires of you? Calder did not hesitate. I do, with everything I have and everything I intend to become. Elder Bryn lifted the moonwater bowl, the same ritual, the same tradition, and the bonding fire burned silver and gold. When they pressed their joined hands over the flame, the reaction was not what anyone expected. It was not just the smoke that rose. It was light, from their joined hands from the fire, and from the cradle where Vela and Bran had woken at the moment of contact and were now both fully awake, their markings blazing at full brilliance. Silver and gold together, brighter than the fire, brighter than the moon overhead, rising into the pre-dawn sky like a second dawn starting from the wrong direction. Every wolf in the 5 kingdoms who had felt that pulse 3 months ago, the crack of something opening, the door that had been shut for 100 years swinging wide, felt it again now. Stronger, complete. The old wolves wept. They knew what it meant. The young wolves reached for each other, pulled together by something they didn't have names for yet. Pack leaders who had been in territorial disputes for years looked at each other across council rooms and felt the petty weight of their arguments suddenly lighten. It was not magic exactly, or it was magic, but the ordinary kind, the kind that happens when the truth is finally spoken loud enough that the lies around it simply can't hold their shape. In the years that followed, people would point to that morning as the moment things began to change. They would argue about which part mattered most, the light, the treaty reforms, the restoration of the Voss bloodline, the exposure of the Davin falsifications. They would tell the story differently in different kingdoms, emphasizing different details depending on what they needed it to mean. But people who had been there, who had stood on that lawn and felt that light move through them, did not argue about it. They simply said, I was there when it happened. I saw the children. I felt it in my bones. Vela and Bran grew up knowing the full shape of their history. Rena made sure of it, not to burden them, but to arm them. She read them Elindra's journals by firelight when they were old enough to understand. She took them to the temple in the northern forest every year, so they would never forget where they came from or what it had cost to survive. She taught them that power was not the absence of suffering, but what you chose to build from it. She taught them that the bond between fated mates was real and strong, and also fragile in exactly the ways that mattered, and that love without honesty and trust was just a beautiful cage. She taught them, most of all, that the Voss name meant something, that it had always meant something, that it had survived fire and exile and deliberate destruction, because truth has a way of waiting, patient as stone, for the right person to carry it into the light. Calder learned to be present in all the small ways that actually counted, not the grand gestures, but the consistent ones. He was there every morning. He was there when they were sick and when they were difficult and when they were extraordinary, which was often. He learned, slowly and not without failure, to trust before he had proof, to lean into rather than away from the things that mattered most. It was the hardest thing he had ever done and the most important. He and Rena were not a fairy tale. They were two people who had broken something between them and spent years rebuilding it into something truer and stronger than it had been before, and they did not pretend otherwise. Their love was not simple. It was earned, constantly, daily, in the choices they made when the easier option was always available. But on the nights when the moon was full and the valley below the keep was quiet, when the children were asleep and the fire was low and the whole world felt like it was holding its breath, Calder would find Rena in the lunar garden, always there, always with a book or a journal or simply with her own thoughts, and he would sit beside her without ceremony, and she would lean her head against his shoulder without being asked. And the bond between them, that living, breathing thread that had survived rejection and exile and poison and distance, would hum quietly between them like something that had always known it would outlast everything else. It did. Some bonds are made in ceremony. The real ones are made in what comes after.